The last good day began with the particular gold of a Colorado September, a light so pure and sharp it seemed to pour directly from the veins of the sky. Elias Vance, a man whose soul was as deeply fissured and layered as the rock formations he studied, considered this light a form of geological poetry. He was a competent idealist, a geologist who believed the story of the Earth was the most profound epic ever written. And he was determined to teach its language to his twin daughters, Luna and Celeste. At 6 years old, they were his most eager students, two identical satellites orbiting his patient, steady presence. Elias was an expert in this wilderness, the Uncompahgre National Forest, a sprawling tapestry of aspen groves, granite peaks, and shadowed canyons. He could read the landscape like a map, identifying the subtle shift in vegetation that signaled a water source or the type of scree that warned of instability. This expertise, however, was not a shield of arrogance, but a cloak of reverence. He moved through the world with a quiet confidence that inspired trust, a quality that made him a brilliant field scientist and an even better father. The vulnerability factor, as any incident report would later term it, was his profound, almost cellular love for the girls. They were mirror images, with hair the color of spun corn silk and eyes that held the solemn blue of a mountain lake. Dressed in matching red jackets, they flanked him on the trail, their tiny hiking boots scuffing up the pine-scented dust. "See this, my little moonbeam?" Elias said, crouching down and pointing a calloused finger at a line of dark rock cutting through the lighter granite. Luna, always the more serious, peered intently. "That's an igneous intrusion, a dike. Hot magma forced its way up through a crack millions of years ago." Celeste, the dreamer, was more interested in a ladybug navigating the rock's surface. "Is it hot now, Papa?" she asked, her voice a tiny bell. Elias chuckled, a warm, rumbling sound. "No, my little star, it's had a very long time to cool down, just like Papa after he has his morning coffee." He taught them not with lectures, but with stories, transforming geological time into a grand family history of mountains being born, growing old, and crumbling to dust. They were his world, and he was their anchor, their encyclopedia, their sun. Around 2 in the afternoon, at a scenic overlook gazing out towards Wetterhorn Peak, Elias performed the small ritual that would become a cornerstone of the investigation. He had the girls sit on a sun-warmed boulder, their faces smudged with a bit of dirt and leftover chocolate. He wove crowns for them from late-season wildflowers and then, stepping back, framed them with his phone. The resulting photograph was perfect. It was a proof of life, a frozen moment of unblemished happiness. Luna's brow was furrowed in her typical thoughtful concentration, while Celeste had her head tilted, a faint, ethereal smile playing on her lips. Behind them, the jagged peaks tore at the sky. He texted the photo to his wife, Clara, with a simple caption, "My queens surveying their kingdom, heading back down soon. Love you." Back in their small house in Ridgeway, Clara's phone chimed. She smiled when she saw the picture. It was so quintessentially Elias. She saved the image, her heart swelling with a familiar, comfortable warmth. She pictured them on the trail, could almost hear the sound of Elias's patient explanations and the girls' high-pitched questions. She replied, "My beautiful adventurers, dinner will be ready. Love you more," and then turned her attention back to the pot of chili simmering on the stove, the comforting aroma of cumin and garlic filling the house. The hours began to pass as the sun slid lower, painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet. At 5 o'clock, Clara glanced at the clock, a flicker of annoyance touching her. Elias was often late when he was in the geological zone, but he was usually more mindful with the girls. She rationalized it away. He'd probably found a fascinating outcrop of pegmatite and lost track of time. By 6, with the chili now on low and the sky outside a deep, bruised purple, the annoyance had curdled into a small, cold knot of unease. He wasn't answering his phone. That wasn't entirely unusual. Cell service in the high country was a fickle thing. But he carried a satellite messenger for emergencies. He should have at least sent a pre-programmed all okay message if they were running significantly late. She started pacing the length of the kitchen, her bare feet cold on the slate floor. Her mind began to build scenarios, each one a little darker than the last. Maybe they took a wrong turn on a spur trail. But Elias knew these trails better than their own backyard. Maybe one of the girls had twisted an ankle, and he was carrying her, slowing them down. That felt plausible. It felt manageable. She clung to that thought, repeating it to herself like a mantra. But beneath the rationalizations, a deeper, more primal dread was beginning to uncoil. The light had completely failed now, and the house, once a cozy haven, felt cavernous and silent. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a footstep that wasn't there. She stood at the large picture window in the living room, staring out at the impenetrable blackness where the mountains should be. They were out there, in that vast, indifferent dark. The image of the girls' smiling faces in the photo now seemed like a ghostly imprint from another lifetime. The knot in her stomach tightened, a physical pain that made it hard to breathe. At 7:30, the rationalizations had evaporated, leaving only the stark, terrifying silence on the other end of the phone. She could no longer pretend. Something was wrong. Her hand trembled as she picked up her phone, the screen unnaturally bright in the dim room. Her thumb hovered over the numbers 911. It felt like a monumental betrayal, an admission of failure on a cosmic scale. Pressing the numbers felt like pushing a button that would detonate her entire world. Her breath hitched in a sob as she finally made the call, her voice a fractured whisper when the calm, professional voice of the dispatcher answered. Ouray County 911. What's your emergency? Clara squeezed her eyes shut, the tears finally breaking free. My husband, she choked out, the words tasting like ash. My husband and my 2 little girls. They went for a hike. They were supposed to be home hours ago. The response was immediate and overwhelming, an army mobilized against a ghost. Within an hour, the gravel parking lot at the trailhead was transformed into a bustling command post, its stark artificial light carving a hole in the immense darkness of the forest. Search and rescue volunteers, men and women with weathered faces and the quiet competence of those who routinely confront the unforgiving, arrived in trucks loaded with gear. The Ouray County Sheriff's Office established the incident command structure, a flurry of color-coded vests and crackling radios. Detective Miles Harding, a man whose weary eyes had seen the mountains give up their secrets both beautiful and brutal, took the lead. He met Clara at the edge of the chaos, his presence a small island of calm. He guided her to a heated tent, his voice low and steady as he asked the questions he had to ask. What were they wearing? What was Elias's experience level? Did he have any medical conditions? Clara answered robotically, the details feeling flimsy and useless against the scale of the wilderness. An army, she thought, but the enemy was simply absence. The search methodology was a science of its own, a meticulous and desperate attempt to impose human logic onto a chaotic natural world. Harding and the SAR leaders spread a large topographical map across a folding table. They defined the search area, a massive wedge of terrain based on Elias's intended route, the time of the last communication, and statistical models of how lost persons behave. They laid a grid over the map, dividing the wilderness into manageable sectors. Teams were assigned to each grid square, their task to perform a hasty search of the primary trail, looking for any sign, a footprint, a dropped water bottle, a scrap of clothing. As dawn broke, the second phase began. The air filled with the percussive thrum of a helicopter, its powerful camera sweeping the high alpine basins and ridges, searching for a flash of color, the red of the girls' jackets. On the ground, K-9 units were deployed, their handlers giving the dogs a piece of the twins' clothing to scent. The dogs, whining with eagerness, bounded up the trail, their powerful noses sampling the complex tapestry of smells for the unique signature of the Vance family. The limitations of these techniques became apparent with every passing hour. The forest floor was a thick carpet of pine needles and decaying leaves that held no prints. The terrain was brutally vertical, a maze of steep gullies, dense aspen thickets, and treacherous scree fields that could swallow a person whole. The wind, whispering through the pines, scrambled scents, making the dogs' work a frustrating exercise in futility. A young volunteer named Ben was on a ground team assigned to a sector far off the main trail, a dense, uninviting stretch of north-facing slope. For 6 hours, he had been fighting his way through tangled undergrowth and over moss-slicked deadfall. The work was physically grueling, the altitude making his lungs burn and his head ache. But the psychological toll was worse. It was the sheer, oppressive nothingness. Every rock looked like a discarded pack. Every flash of red turned out to be a patch of Indian paintbrush. He and his partner moved in a slow, painstaking line, their eyes scanning the ground, the trees, the shadows. The silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by their own labored breathing and the rustle of their movements. A feeling of profound hopelessness began to settle over him. They weren't just looking for 3 people anymore. They were looking for a single atom in an entire universe. The scale of it was crushing. He paused to drink some water, looking up at the vast, indifferent face of the mountain. "It's like they just evaporated," he said to his partner, the words swallowed by the immensity. Back at the command post, Clara existed in a state of suspended animation. The tent had become her world, a canvas prison filled with the smell of stale coffee and the constant static of the radios. She watched Harding move with a grim purpose, his face a mask of professional focus. He would bring her updates, his language precise and devoid of false hope. The K-9s lost the scent about a mile up the trail. Air Ops has completed a full sweep of the basin with no visual contact. Each report was a small, sharp blow, chipping away at the fragile shell of her composure. She studied the big map, her eyes tracing the grid lines that dissected the place where her family had vanished. The searchers were just names and call signs to her, disembodied voices on the radio. But she pictured them out there, fighting against the wilderness on her behalf. She felt a strange mix of profound gratitude and utter helplessness. These strangers were risking their own safety for her family, yet she could do nothing but sit and wait, a spectator at the demolition of her own life. She held a spare jacket of Luna's, pressing the soft fleece to her face, trying to inhale a scent that was already fading, replaced by the sterile air of the tent. The hours bled into days, the initial frenetic energy of the search giving way to a grim, grinding marathon of exhaustion and diminishing returns. On the 3rd day, a shout crackled over the radio, sharp and electric. A team searching the banks of Canyon Creek, miles downstream from the trailhead, had found something. It was a small piece of dark blue fabric, snagged on a tangle of driftwood. It was high-performance synthetic material, torn and weathered. Harding brought the Ziploc bag containing the scrap to Clara. Her breath caught in her throat. It looked like the material of the lightweight shell jacket Elias always wore. A new theory, sharp and terrible, but offering a sliver of coherence, instantly took hold. Elias must have fallen into the creek. It was running high and fast with early autumn runoff, a churning torrent of frigid water powerful enough to sweep a grown man off his feet. The false lead sparked a surge of desperate, agonizing hope. If he had fallen in the river, perhaps the girls were waiting for him somewhere on the bank, cold and scared but alive. Or perhaps he had managed to get them to safety before being taken by the current. It was a narrative, a story to replace the terrifying void of not knowing. Hope, even in its most painful form, is a powerful fuel. Immediately, the entire focus of the search pivoted. Resources were reallocated with a renewed, frantic energy. The grid search in the high country was scaled back, and teams were poured into the canyon. Swiftwater rescue specialists, clad in dry suits and helmets, were brought in. They waded into the dangerously cold water, probing the deep pools and undercut banks with long poles. Kayakers paddled the length of the creek, their eyes scanning the shoreline for any sign of color, any disturbance. For 2 solid days, the canyon became the new epicenter of the operation. A helicopter flew low over the water, its downdraft whipping the surface into a frenzy. Divers were sent to explore the deepest, murkiest pools near where the fabric was found. The search was painstaking, dangerous, and emotionally brutal. Every submerged log looked like a body. Every piece of river trash sparked a moment of heart-stopping alarm. Clara, now shuttled between the main command post and a new, smaller one set up by the creek, felt herself being torn apart by the oscillation between hope and despair. The theory was a lifeline, but it was a lifeline made of razor wire. On the evening of the 5th day, the debunking came not with a dramatic discovery, but with a quiet, soul-crushing realization. An analyst back at the main tent, tasked with cataloging Elias's gear from photos Clara had provided, made a simple observation. The jacket Elias was wearing in photos from previous hikes, the one matching the blue fabric, had a distinctive zipper pull from a specific European brand. The scrap of fabric from the river, when examined under a magnifying glass, had a torn edge that indicated it had been part of a seam, not near a zipper. More damningly, a gear expert from the SAR team identified the fabric as belonging to a popular brand of fishing waders, not Elias's jacket. It was a random piece of trash, a coincidence of color and location that had sent an army on a multi-day wild goose chase. The news fell like a physical weight in the command tent. The Swiftwater teams were recalled. The divers surfaced for the last time. The brief, terrible hope ignited by the scrap of cloth was extinguished, leaving behind a colder, deeper darkness. The logistical fallout was immediate, but the emotional fallout was catastrophic. The collective energy of the search evaporated. The mountain had won. That night, a grim-faced sheriff sat down with Clara. He spoke of diminishing returns, of the safety of the volunteers, of the statistical improbability of survival after so many days in the elements. The large-scale, active search was being suspended. They would continue with limited, continuous operations, but the Army was going home. The ghost had remained a ghost. 4 years passed. The world, with its relentless forward momentum, moved on. Seasons turned, snows fell and melted, the aspens blazed gold and were stripped bare, over and over. For most people, the story of the Vance family became a tragic local legend, a cautionary tale whispered to tourists at trailheads. The accepted public theory, cemented by the fruitless search and the false lead of the river, was that Elias had gotten them lost in a sudden storm or had a medical emergency, and the 3 of them had succumbed to the elements in some hidden, unreachable corner of the vast wilderness. It was a clean, sad story. A tragedy, but a closed one. For Clara Vance, however, time had not moved. It had fractured on that September evening, and she was left to live in the jagged, unending moment of their absence. The world saw a grieving widow. She was a keeper of a truth that no one else seemed to believe. The official story was wrong. It felt too simple, too neat. Elias was too competent. The complete lack of any trace, not a footprint, not a wrapper, not a single thread from the girls' red jackets, was not, to her, proof of the wilderness's power to erase. It was proof of an anomaly, a detail that didn't fit. The false narrative became a wall she had to beat against every single day. Her fight was not loud or hysterical. It was a quiet, relentless, methodical siege. She transformed her grief into a project. In the spare bedroom that had once been her office, surrounded by maps, case files, and photos of her family, she built a website, The Vance Twins Vigil. It was a masterclass in organized sorrow, featuring detailed timelines, maps of the search area, and every known fact about the case. She wrote blog posts that were less emotional pleas and more incisive analyses, questioning the assumptions of the search. Why was the scent trail lost so abruptly a mile in, she wrote. Why was no gear ever found when even the most experienced hikers sometimes lose items? She spent her days on the phone, a ghost haunting the periphery of the investigation. She called the retired detective, Miles Harding, once a month. He was patient with her, but his voice carried the weary resignation of a man who had already accepted the mountain's verdict. "Clara, we looked everywhere," he'd say, his voice gentle. There was nothing to find. She would listen, thank him, and then hang up, her resolve hardening. She methodically re-interviewed people herself, tracking down hikers who had been on the mountain that day, her questions sharp and specific. Did you see a truck parked near the less used access road? Did you hear anything unusual? Anything at all? She was a detective without a badge, an emotional anchor, swore who refused to let her family's story be anchored to a convenient lie. One evening, sitting in the blue glow of her monitor, she stared at the picture of Elias and the girls, the one he had sent on that last good day. The image no longer brought her the simple warmth it once had. It was a clue, a puzzle. Her internal monologue was a constant churning engine of analysis. They were heading back down. The photo was taken at 2. "It's a 2-hour hike, Max." Even with dawdling, they should have been at the car by 5. The weather was clear until after dark. No storm. The dogs lost the scent. It didn't fade. It stopped, as if they got into a vehicle. But who and why? Hope, for her, was not a gentle, feathered thing. After 4 years, it was a grim, skeletal structure, the last thing left standing in the ruins of her life. It was a belief not in miracles, but in logic, in the idea that there was an answer, and she would not rest until she found it. The unlikely messengers were 2 college students from Grand Junction, Chloe and Liam, amateur kivers with more enthusiasm than experience. They were in the Uncompahgre for a long weekend, their goal to explore a series of lesser-known, non-commercial caves that riddled a limestone escarpment some 20 miles north of where the main search for the Vances had been concentrated. They were in this remote location precisely because it was remote. They were chasing the thrill of discovery, of being the first to map a new passage. On their second day, they rappelled into the mouth of a narrow fissure known locally as the Sieve. The air immediately grew cold and damp, smelling of wet stone and ancient stillness. They moved deeper, their headlamps cutting sharp cones of white light through the absolute black. An hour in, they had to squeeze through a tight passage, a section known as the Rib Cage. On the other side, the cave opened into a small, surprisingly dry chamber. It was here that Liam's light caught a flash of unnatural color against the pale gray rock. He stopped, his heart giving a sudden, hard thump. "Whoa, Chloe, check this out." He moved his light back. Tucked into a crevice, partially covered in a fine layer of dust and calcite deposits, was a small backpack. It was made of bright pink synthetic fabric, adorned with a faded cartoon unicorn. It was a child's backpack. Chloe came up beside him, her own light joining his. The silence of the cave seemed to deepen. This was not a discarded piece of tourist trash. They were miles from any marked trail, deep inside a cave that required technical gear to access. A child had no business being here. A chill that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature washed over them. Slowly, as if handling a holy relic, Liam reached out and gently pulled the backpack from the crevice. It was light, almost empty. He unzipped the main compartment. Inside was a half-eaten bag of fruit snacks, a small, smooth stone, and a single mitten. The discovery hung in the air between them, heavy and ominous. Its significance was slowly dawning. They both knew the stories. Every local did. The Vance girls. "Liam," Chloe whispered, her voice tight. This can't be." They stood there for a long time, the beams of their headlamps illuminating the small, pathetic object. The internal debate began immediately. Should they leave it? Take it? Who would even believe them? The location was so far from the original search area, so improbable. "We have to report this," Liam said, his voice firm, though his hands were shaking. "We have to." The journey out of the cave was a tense, silent affair. The thrill of exploration was gone, replaced by a sense of solemn duty and a creeping dread. The small pink backpack, now carefully placed inside Liam's own pack, felt like it weighed 100 pounds. They drove straight to the Ouray County Sheriff's Office. The deputy at the front desk, a young man who had been in high school when the Vances disappeared, looked at them with bored skepticism as they unspooled their story. But when Liam carefully placed the unicorn backpack on the counter, the deputy's expression shifted. He recognized it. The image of the girls and their gear had been seared into the local consciousness. He made a call. 20 minutes later, a tired-looking man in a rumpled suit walked into the lobby. It was Detective Harding, now only a few years from retirement, the Vance case a permanent, unresolved weight on his career. He looked at the two students, then at the backpack on the counter. He picked it up, his face unreadable. He didn't need to ask. He remembered the inventory lists. He remembered the press conference photos. He turned the bag over in his hands, the faded unicorn staring up at him. After 4 years of absolute silence, a ghost had finally whispered a new word. The unicorn backpack was sent to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's Forensic Laboratory in Denver, a state-of-the-art facility that hummed with the quiet, sterile efficiency of science. The procedural deep dive began in the Trace Evidence Unit under the purview of Dr. Anya Sharma, a forensic botanist with a doctorate in palynology, the study of pollen and spores. Dr. Sharma was a woman of immense patience, a human being who thought on a microscopic scale. To her, a speck of dust was not just a speck of dust, it was a time capsule, a geographical fingerprint. Her lab was a sanctuary of gleaming chrome and glass, mass spectrometers, high-powered comparison microscopes, and climate-controlled evidence lockers. She received the backpack with the standard case file, a summary of a cold case she vaguely remembered from the news years ago. Her process was methodical. She first photographed the bag from every angle. Then, in a clean room designed to prevent cross-contamination, she used a specialized vacuum with a filtered nozzle to meticulously collect every particle of microscopic debris from the bag's exterior fabric, its zippers, and its interior lining. This collected dust was then prepared for analysis, a delicate process of chemical baths to dissolve silicates and carbonates, isolating the incredibly resilient pollen grains. The scientific principle at play was simple in concept, but complex in execution. Every plant produces pollen with a unique size, shape, and surface texture. These grains, nearly indestructible, are dispersed by wind and animals, creating a pollen rain that is specific to a particular location and season. A pine forest has a different pollen signature than an alpine meadow, which has a different signature than a riparian willow grove. By identifying the specific species of pollen found on an object, Dr. Sharma could, with astonishing accuracy, determine the environment where that object had been. She spent a day at her microscope, painstakingly identifying and counting the grains. Much of what she found was expected. High concentrations of ponderosa pine, Engelmann spruce, and various grass pollens, all consistent with the general environment of the Uncompahgre National Forest. But then, she found it. The moment of discovery was not a dramatic shout, but a subtle intake of breath, a slight narrowing of her eyes. Under the powerful lens was a single, unmistakable grain. It was large, spherical, and covered in delicate hooked spines. She cross-referenced it with her digital atlas. Campanula uniflora, the Arctic bellflower, a rare, tiny purple flower that grew only under very specific conditions: high altitude, north-facing, limestone-rich scree slopes that held moisture late into the season. It was a specialist, a flower that existed in isolated, fragile microclimates. Her fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up geological surveys and botanical field reports for the Uncompahgre region. Her initial findings were confirmed. Campanula uniflora had only ever been officially documented in one specific area of the forest, a secluded, high-altitude valley known as the Shadow Creek Basin, a place notorious for its unique limestone geology. She checked the map from the Vance case file. The original search grid was massive, but it was centered nearly 20 miles south of the Shadow Creek Basin. The pollen on the backpack constituted a forensic proof that the bag, and by extension its owner, had at some point been in a place the search had never even touched. The finding was a logical paradox. The backpack was found in a cave system miles away from Shadow Creek Basin, but it carried the undeniable fingerprint of having been there. Dr. Sharma typed up her report, her language precise and clinical. She highlighted the anomalous pollen, explained its ecological significance, and attached a map pinpointing the known habitats of Campanula uniflora. The final document was a bombshell disguised as a scientific paper. When Detective Harding received the report via a secure email, he read it twice, then a third time. He wasn't a scientist, but Dr. Sharma had explained it so clearly that he felt like one. The intellectual shock was staggering. For 4 years, they had all been operating under a false premise. They had searched the wrong mountain. The entire case, which had been a cold, solid mass of tragic certainty, had just been turned on its head. It was no longer a story about a man getting lost. The pollen didn't just move a location. It implied a sequence of events, a journey that made no sense. How does a little girl's backpack get from a remote valley to a cave 20 miles away? The laws of physics and botany had just screamed that something was profoundly, terribly wrong with the accepted story. Harding stood up and walked to the large map of the forest still pinned to his office wall, a relic of the failed search. He found the Shadow Creek Basin, a place that had been nothing more than empty space on the edge of their map. He stared at it, a cold dread mixing with the electric thrill of a hunt unexpectedly reborn. The ghost was no longer whispering. It was drawing a map. The next morning, Harding assembled a small team in the station's briefing room. His younger, more tech-savvy partner, Detective Eva Rostova, and a grizzled sheriff's deputy who knew the county's backroads better than anyone. He laid Dr. Sharma's report on the table. "For 4 years, we assumed Elias Vance went missing somewhere in this box," Harding said, tapping the old search grid on the map. "Forensics now says we were wrong. The key object, Luna Vance's backpack, was at some point definitively here." He pointed to the small, isolated area of the Shadow Creek Basin. The room was silent as the implications sank in. "It's a paradox," Rostova said, her brow furrowed. "The pack is found in the Sieve Caves, but the pollen says it was in the basin. That's a 20-mile gap over rough terrain. A 6-year-old girl didn't make that journey alone." The team began to brainstorm, their new theory taking shape on a whiteboard. The most logical explanation for the paradox was human intervention. Someone had taken the Vances from the original trail. They had taken them to the Shadow Creek Basin. Later, for some unknown reason, the backpack was moved to the cave. The new investigation methodology began not with a physical search, but with a digital one. Rostova began building what she called the ghost map. she layered data onto a digital topographic map. The known habitats of the rare flower, old mining claim records from the 19th and 20th centuries, property ownership maps, and Forest Service access roads, many of which were little more than forgotten dirt tracks. The Shadow Creek Basin was remote, but it wasn't entirely empty. There were a handful of old patented mining claims, small parcels of private land surrounded by a sea of national forest. Most of these are defunct, Rostova said, zooming in on one particular parcel. But this one, the county records show property taxes are still being paid by a family trust. It's an old silver claim from the 1890s, the Morning Star claim. The name sent a chill down Harding's spine. Luna and Celeste, moon and star. A sickening coincidence. The new search was organized not as a massive grid, but as a targeted expedition. A small team, led by Harding, drove up a barely passable Forest Service road, the truck groaning in low gear. The terrain in the Shadow Creek Basin was different from the original search area. The air was thinner, the trees more stunted, the ground a stark white-gray from the limestone. There was a palpable sense of isolation, a quiet so profound it felt like a pressure on the ears. They found the boundaries of the Morning Star claim marked by old, decaying wooden posts. The area was dominated by the collapsed adit of an old mine and the ruins of a small cabin. The team began a meticulous fingertip search. The renewed sense of purpose was tangible. They weren't just looking for remains anymore. They were looking for the primary crime scene. After 2 hours, the deputy let out a low whistle. "Detective, over here." He was standing near a shallow depression behind the cabin ruins, an area where the soil seemed looser, disturbed. They began to dig. Less than 2 feet down, they found him. The partial skeletal remains were unmistakably those of an adult male. The coroner, who had accompanied them, would later confirm through dental records that it was Elias Vance. His skull showed a fracture consistent with a fall, suggesting the initial part of the story might have been an accident after all. It was a somber, significant discovery, but it was what they found next that changed everything. As they carefully excavated the area around the remains, one of the investigators unearthed another object, buried just beside where Elias's hand would have been. It was not a piece of hiking gear. It was a small bird, exquisitely carved from a piece of aspenwood, its wings half spread. It was smooth to the touch, clearly made by a skilled and patient hand. Harding stared at the wooden bird lying in the palm of his glove. It was a nested discovery. They had found the victim, confirming a location, but they had also found this totem, this foreign object that did not belong to the world of Elias Vance, the geologist, or his 2 small daughters. This was a clue that pointed not to a tragic accident, but to a human antagonist, a shadow who had been present at the moment of Elias's death, a shadow who had left their own signature in this lonely, forgotten place. The hunt for the antagonist began with the small wooden bird. Back in the office, Harding and Rostova launched a procedural deep dive that was a masterclass in modern cold case investigation. Rostova photographed the carving from every conceivable angle, creating a 3D model she could share digitally. Their first step was to treat the object like any other piece of evidence, running it through the typical channels. They sent images to the FBI's Art Crime Unit, to national databases of missing artifacts, and to cultural property experts. The results were all negative. The bird wasn't a known artifact or a piece of commercial art. It was folk art, personal and local. This was both a frustration and a potential advantage. It narrowed the search from the entire world to this specific corner of Colorado. They hit dead ends for days. They showed the photos to local gallery owners and artists in Ridgway and Telluride, but no one recognized the style. The hunt felt like it was stalling before it had even begun. The frustration in the office was thick enough to taste. The breakthrough, when it came, was from an unexpected quarter. On a hunch, Rostova started digging into local historical society archives and library records, searching for any mention of whittling, carving, or folk art in the region over the past 50 years. After hours of scrolling through digitized community newsletters and local history pamphlets, she found it. A small, grainy photo in a 1982 article from a now-defunct local paper. The article was about surviving mountain traditions, and it featured a brief profile of a reclusive man named Jedediah Thorne, who lived an isolated, off-grid life, and was known for carving small, intricate animals from scavenged wood. The photo accompanying the article showed Jedediah holding a half-finished carving of a fox. The style, the smooth lines, the particular way the eye was carved as a simple, deep hole, was identical to the bird. The hunt suddenly had a name. With a name, the floodgates opened. Rostova and Harding dug into every record they could find on Jedediah Thorne. He was now in his late 60s. He and his wife, Martha, had purchased a small, isolated homestead in the 1970s, a parcel of land that bordered the old Morning Star mining claim in the Shadow Creek Basin. They had no children. They were deeply religious, belonging to a small, non-denominational fundamentalist sect that eschewed most modern technology. They had no criminal records, but there were a few old county records of disputes with the Forest Service over land use. A picture began to form of a couple who had deliberately and completely cut themselves off from the world, living a life of harsh, self-imposed austerity. The socio-economic context was one of chosen poverty, a rejection of the modern world in favor of a stark, 19th-century existence. Before the confrontation, Harding needed to be sure. He drove his personal car up a public road that passed within a quarter-mile of the Thorne homestead. From a distance, with binoculars, he could see it. A simple log cabin with smoke curling from a stone chimney. A large vegetable garden. A few chickens scratching in the dirt. It looked peaceful, idyllic. But knowing what he knew, the isolation felt sinister. He saw a woman, stout and gray-haired, hanging laundry on a line. Martha. He saw no sign of Jedediah, or anyone else. The motive was still a gaping hole, but the profile was chillingly complete. A childless couple, living in near total isolation, deeply religious, living next door to the very spot where a man and his 2 young daughters had vanished. The pieces were all there, forming a terrifying mosaic. Harding drove back down the mountain. The image of the quiet cabin burned into his mind. The shadow finally had a face and an address. The approach was quiet. Harding and Rostova drove the unmarked vehicle as far as the road would allow and walked the last quarter-mile to the Thorne homestead. The air was still, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the gravel path. The cabin sat in a small clearing, looking like something lifted from a history book. There were no power lines, no satellite dish. As they got closer, they saw a man, gaunt and weathered, with a long gray beard, sitting on the porch, a piece of wood and a knife in his hands. Jedediah Thorne. He looked up as they approached, his eyes set deep in a web of wrinkles, showing no surprise, only a profound, ancient weariness. He didn't stand. Martha came to the doorway, wiping her hands on an apron. She was a sturdy woman, her face a mask of stoic resignation. "We knew this day would come," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "We have prayed for it." Harding stood on the bottom step of the porch, keeping his posture non-threatening. "Ma'am, sir, I'm Detective Harding. This is Detective Rostova. We need to talk to you about Elias Vance and his daughters." The confession, when it came, was not a dramatic outburst, but a slow, sorrowful unburdening. It was Martha who spoke, while Jedediah sat silently, his hands finally still, the knife and wood resting on the porch beside him. They invited the detectives inside. The cabin was sparse and clean, lit by oil lamps even in the daytime. Martha sat them down at a simple wooden table and began to speak, her voice a low monotone, as if reciting a story she had told herself 1,000 times. This was the first barrel of the reveal. "He fell," she said, her eyes fixed on the grain of the table. "We heard a shout. Jedediah went to look. The man, he had slipped on the scree near the old mine. His head had hit a rock. He was already gone when we got to him." She described their panic. They lived in fear of the outside world, of government and authority. Answering questions, getting involved, it was their worst nightmare. They saw the 2 little girls huddled together, crying, their red jackets like flames against the gray rock. "We didn't know what to do," she continued. "We brought the girls here. They were so cold. We gave them soup. And we buried the man. We said a prayer over him. We thought it was a mercy to give him a Christian burial, to not let the animals get him." She explained how they had taken the man's truck, driven it miles away to a different trailhead, and left it, hoping everyone would think they had gone missing there. It was a simple, desperate plan, born of panic and a deep-seated paranoia. As she finished, a sense of resolution settled over Harding. It was tragic, a terrible series of misjudgments, but it solved the primary mystery: manslaughter, illegal disposal of a body, obstruction. But it was an answer. The Vances weren't lost. They were found. "Thank you for telling us, Martha," Harding said, his voice gentle. He felt a wave of relief, the satisfaction of closing a case that had haunted him for years. The story was over. But then a loose thread began to bother him. He looked at Martha, whose story had been delivered in the past tense, a historical account. "You said girls, plural," Harding began, the pivotal question forming slowly, carefully. "When we found Mr. Vance, the scene was just as you described. And we know about Luna. The cavers found her backpack, which led us to this valley. We found her. She'd been living in the caves. Feral, but alive. We got her out last week." He paused, letting the information sink in. He watched Martha's face. A flicker of something, shock, confusion, crossed her features. "But you keep saying the girls. We only found one girl. Where is Celeste?" The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy. Martha looked at Jedediah, a silent, lightning-fast communication passing between them. Jedediah gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Martha turned back to Harding, and for the first time a tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. The second barrel was delivered with 4 simple words that detonated the entire room, the entire case, the entire world. "We don't have Celeste." Harding stared, uncomprehending. "What do you mean?" Martha's voice broke, a dam of grief and confusion finally giving way. "The one we have, the one who is setting the table for supper right now. We thought she was Celeste. We call her Sarah." In that horrifying, silent moment, the final shocking twist was revealed. They had only ever found one girl that day. The other one, Luna, had run in the chaos, vanishing into the wilderness before they could catch her. For 4 years, the Thorns had been raising one of the Vance twins, believing the other had perished in the wild. And for 4 years, Luna had survived on her own, a ghost child in the mountains, a feral creature living in the deep, dark silence of the caves until she was found. The investigators had assumed the girl they rescued was the only survivor. The Thorns had assumed the girl they took was the only survivor, and in that chasm of false assumptions, the truth had lain hidden. From the other room, they heard the soft clink of cutlery on a plate and a small, clear voice call out, "Mama, is it time to eat?" The sound was both utterly mundane and the most terrifying thing Harding had ever heard. The recovery was a delicate, surreal operation. A child psychologist was brought in, a gentlewoman who entered the cabin alone while Harding and Rostova waited outside. The girl they called Sarah, the girl who was truly Celeste. came out holding the psychologist's hand. She was 10 years old now, with long, pale hair, her eyes holding a mixture of fear and confusion. She looked at the strangers, at the police cars that had materialized in her silent world, and began to cry. Clara was waiting at a safe location down the mountain. The reunion was not the cinematic embrace she had spent 4 years imagining. When Celeste was brought to her, the girl shied away, hiding behind the psychologist. This woman, her biological mother, was a stranger. Clara's heart broke all over again, a new and more complicated kind of fracture. She didn't rush. She simply sat on the floor a few feet away and spoke in a soft voice, not trying to touch her, just letting her daughter hear the sound of a voice she hadn't heard since she was 6. The other recovery had already happened, but was no less complex. Luna, found crawling in the back of the Sieve cave system by the SAR team Harding had dispatched, was less a person and more a bundle of survival instincts. She was nonverbal, malnourished, her eyes unaccustomed to light, her skin covered in scratches. She flinched from human touch. She had survived impossibly for 4 years, likely finding water in the cave and foraging for insects, roots, and whatever else she could scavenge in the brief, terrified trips she must have made to the outside world. Her backpack was the one thing she had kept, a link to a life she couldn't remember. The legal fate of the antagonists was swift. Faced with the undeniable evidence and their own confessions, Jedediah and Martha Thorne pleaded guilty. They were charged with kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and improper disposal of human remains. Their defense argued they were not malicious, merely misguided and terrified. But the law was clear. They were sentenced to decades in prison, their self-imposed isolation replaced by a state-mandated one. They would die in a world they had tried so desperately to escape. The complicated aftermath was Clara's new reality. Her home was no longer empty, but it was not whole. It was a hospital, a rehabilitation center, a house of strangers. Celeste, or Sarah, as she still sometimes called herself, struggled with her identity, caught between 2 sets of parents, 2 names, 2 lives. She had memories of a quiet life with the Thornes, a life she now understood as a lie, and those memories warred with the faint, dreamlike echoes of a father who taught her about rocks and a sister who was her other half. Luna's journey was even longer. She spent months in a specialized facility, slowly being coaxed back into the human world. Language came back in fits and starts, disjointed words from a buried past. The bond between the twins, once a perfect symmetry, was now a chasm of trauma and divergent experience. Celeste was a girl raised in isolation. Luna was a girl raised by it. A final, reflective scene took place nearly a year later. Clara sat on the back porch of her house, watching her daughters in the yard. They were not playing together, not yet. Luna was sitting in the grass, intently studying a beetle on her finger, a habit that was an echo of her father. Celeste was on the swing set, pushing herself higher and higher, her face turned towards the sky. They were 2 separate points of light, no longer the perfect constellation they had once been. Justice had been served, the truth had been found, her daughters were home. But healing was not a destination. It was a long, arduous walk. Clara watched them, her heart a vessel of profound, bittersweet love. She had fought a war against a ghost, and, in a way, she had won. But victory was not a parade. It was this: a quiet afternoon, the scent of pine on the breeze, and the monumental, uncertain, and deeply precious task of teaching 2 strangers that they were a family.